Good morning, crime community. I was going to read about Byron or somebody, but I'm going to read about Percy Bysshe Shelley instead. Poet and revolutionary Jacqueline Mulhallen. First love of Percy Bysshe Shelley. The Groves visited Field Place in August 1808, and Shelley and his cousin, Harriet, fell in love. Although they were only to meet a few times over the next couple of years, they kept a regular correspondence, not discouraged by either family, who would not have disapproved of a marriage between them. Tom Wedgwood remembered Harriet as being like some Madonna of Raphael. He never saw another woman who could compete with her beauty. The families met in London in April 1809 and went to the opera and the theater together. Shelley rode proudly to Tisdale to observe who I am with. Perhaps inspired by Harriet, Shelley now embarked on a very creative period. He wrote a novel, Zastrozzi, in the Gothic style, set in the Alps and in Venice, with storms, dungeons, and palaces, and featuring a conniving, revengeful villain, Zastrozzi, and the disassembling murderess, Matilda, who plotted to estrange the hero from his true love, Julia. Victor and Kazare was printed by C&W Phillips at Worthing and Timothy's agreement, and Shelley wrote over to supervise and perhaps help with the printing. Shelley and Elizabeth collaborate again on a comedy which they sent to the famous comedy actor Charles Matthews, who returned it saying it wouldn't do for acting. Shelley tried writing a tragedy and a narrative poem, The Wandering Jew. St. Irvine, the novel, he completed in the autumn of 1810. Although similar to Zastrozzi, it's an Gothic tale and setting expresses views against the established religion and marriage, which they had been derived from Godwin's political justice. Given his generosity to the poor and sense of injustice as a child, Shelley may have been particularly receptive to Godwin's opinions. Godwin begins to emphasizing the importance of education and saying that explaining and reasoning with children is a better method than beating and punishing them. Shelley was angry when he visited his sister's school and found Helen with a black mark hung around her neck. If dissenters and Catholics were considered outsiders in the repressive environment of the Britain War with Napoleonic France, atheists were viewed as even worse. Some writers rejected Orthodox religion for reasons of science, radical politics, and comparative mythology. Those who supported the views of George Cuvier, who had studied prehistoric remains and consequently did not subscribe to the accepted age of the earth, or Sir William Jones, who attempted to show the similarities between all religions, which regarded with the suspicion Burke's reflections had associated free thinkers with the French Revolution, and radicals were accounted atheists and atheists radicals, although this was not necessarily the case. Most people in England were sincerely Christian. Harriet Grove's brother, Charles, and at least two of Shelley's close friends, Eaton, Leslie, and Holiday, were to become clergymen. Many radicals and atheists during the period either changed or concealed their views. Medwin describes Timothy Shelley as not very religious, but although he occasionally went to the parish church and made his servants regularly attend divine service, he possessed no true devotion himself and inculcated none to his son. Charles Grove remembers that in the spring of 1810, Shelley was fully of life and spirits and very well pleased with his successful devotion to my sister Harriet, whom he was more attracted to than I can express. Harriet's repeated references to dear Bysshe and her hopes of visiting Field Place show that the two were sincere and she was happy when they met in April 1810. She had hurt her foot, so she managed to get 2 evenings at home with Shelley and her mother while the others went out. According to Grove, she became uneasy at the tone of the letters on speculative subjects, i.e. religion, and she therefore ended the relationship. But Helen Shelley believed that it was ended because of Harriet's father. Shelley, judging his correspondence with Hogg later in the year, was not yet an atheist, although he sent Harriet a copy of John Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding and may have relayed views of political justice, which was likely to alarm her family. Many of the references to Shelley's letter are heavily crossed out in her diary, and she may have later wished to hide his speculative remarks. The fact that her family was throwing her together with a young and wealthy clergyman, William Helyar, suggested that Harriet was being persuaded. She eventually married Helyar. Shelley also sent Harriet Victor and Kazare, but he and Elizabeth had made a tactless mistake. Harriet's sister Charlotte, who had been on the visit to her, and Shelley's uncle, Captain John Pilford, was very taken with Colonel Surgeson. The later letter from Harriet to Elizabeth included some mocking lines, hoping that Surgeson would fall in love with Charlotte. The young woman is not supposed to initiate a relationship, and even a woman as attractive as Charlotte must have been considered to be on the shelf in her mid-20s. Elizabeth was probably meant to be cruel, and it arrived at a particularly sad time. Harriet's younger sister, Louisa, had just died. Harriet wrote, Charlotte's offended, and with reason, as I think they have done very wrong in publishing what they have of her. When Shelley's novel, St. Irvyne, arrived, Charlotte read it and disapproved. Oxford. When Shelley went up to Oxford, he must have been very depressed, not knowing if the relationship could be healed. Norfolk was encouraging him to take up a parliamentary career, suggesting that a pragmatic view was the very best, and there was an agreement that Shelley would have his father's seat when he reached the age of 21. Although he must have already had doubts that he believed in them, Shelley had subscribed to the 39th article of the Church of England when enrolling in Oxford. An Oxford education and a career in politics would be closed to him otherwise. Godwin's view was that it is impossible for anyone to believe all of the articles. A clergyman starts his career in duplicity and prevarication. Shelley was not intending to be a clergyman, but he and others who wanted to take part in public life had to start their careers in the same way. Hogg suggested that Shelley might have expressed the desire for a career in literature to Norfolk, who advised Shelley to start young in whichever career he chose. Shelley was perhaps thinking of combining the two when his father took him to the booksellers, Slater and Munday, on his arrival at Oxford and said, my son here has a literary turn. He is already an author, and do pray indulge him in his printing freaks. Munday published the very liberal newspaper, Oxford University and City Herald, which had a wide circulation over a southern countries. Oxford was a very conservative town which had burnt Tom Paine in effigy in 1793. At the university, the morose, insipid, and profligate professors did not have to lecture and did rarely so. Examinations were a farce. Students seldom failed, and degrees were awarded on lengths of residence. Discipline was lax and expulsions rare. Undergraduates were hunting, shooting, and fishing, and flirting with the young women of Oxford. In 1810, the Edinburgh Review published a series of articles attacking Oxford, complaining that the English clergy in these hands' education entirely prevented debate upon the moral and political truth in case it ended in religious skepticism. Edward Copplestone, professor of poetry at Oxford, replied defending the Oxford stance. Shelley possibly started off on the wrong side of the University College. In 1809, the college had supported Lord Eldon, one of its members, in the context for the election of chancellor, and the other members hoped for preferment through him. Shelby and his father had written in the Morning Chronicle supporting the Whig candidate, Lord Grenville, who was pro-Catholic emancipation. The college might have been equally upset when Shelley supported the Oxford Herald and its campaign to help Peter Finnerty, formerly the editor of the United Irishmen's Journal, The Press. In 1797, the leading United Irishman, Theobald Wolfe Tone, went to France and convinced Bonaparte that France had sent 1,400 troops to Ireland, but severe storms meant that they could not land. The English army, however, under the instruction of Lord Castlereagh, chief secretary of the Lord Lieutenant, arrested and tortured 500 and executed 50. Finnery published an article accusing Castlereagh of the brutality and citing the case of William Orr as judicial murderer. Orr was convicted on the word of two government-paid informers, and his defense counsel, John Philbot Curran, was not allowed to speak. Curran acted for Finnery at the trial for sedition. Finnerty took his opportunity to expose Castlereagh, who was found guilty and sentenced to a pillory and 2 years in prison. But he said, I can suffer anything provided it promotes the liberty of my country, and the pillory was a triumph for him. He was cheered by a large crowd and summoned by leading United Irishmen, Lord Edward Fitzgerald and Arthur O'Connell's, owner of the press. Printer John Stockdale was sentenced to 6 months and his press and type smashed. After his release from prison in Ireland, Finnerly, who knew Sheridan, came to England to work for the Morning Chronicle. In 1809, he sent to cover the expedition ordered by Castlereagh, now Secretary of State of War, intended to block the French fleet at Antwerp. Owing to delay and incompetence in the part of the commanders, 20,000 British lives were lost, mostly from typhus on the fever marshes. The Walcheren disaster. Finnery wrote in an expose of the exposition and also referred to Castlereagh's actions in Ireland. He was sentenced to 2 years in Lincoln Prison, where he was badly treated. Burdett launched a campaign in his support in London with the help of the Examiner, and the Oxford Herald did the same 3 days later. To raise money for the Herald's campaign, Shelley wrote a poem, a poetical essay on the existing state of things, which the newspaper published. Shelley is said to have raised £100 for Finnerty by his poem, which meant that he would have sold 1,000 copies. This seems a great many, but it is not impossible given the Oxford Herald's wide circulation. Shortly after he arrived, Shelley met Hogg, a son of a well-to-do Yorkshire barrister who was considered to be a very bright student. Like Shelley, Hogg had also written a novel. Neither of them was expressed with the teachings at Oxford, and they found in each other the intellectual stimulation that the university did not provide. Although Hogg did not share Shelley's love of chemistry, he was fascinated by his description of the benefit science could bring, and he remarked that Shelley read an unusual number of books, including the Plato, Plutarch, and Euripides in the original Greek and Latin without interpretation or notes. Hogg described Shelley as a Republican and said that he had an indistinguishable thirst for knowledge and boundless philanthropy, and at the same time, philanthropy meant a love of humanity and a desire for equality rather than tax-deductible donations in charity, while Republicans were in favor of equality and not just the abolition of the monarchy. Hogg says that many of Shelley's Eton friends were at Oxford, and they frequently called at his room for gatherings with poetry and wine. This story is confirmed by a note from Shelley's to a friend, Jamie Rowe. Hogg, who was later to become more conservative, while writes critically about Shelley's political views, but he may have been so cynical at the time. He admits that there was no lack of beardless politicians among us. Of these, some were more strenuous supporters of the popular causes of our little circles than others, but all were abundantly liberal. Timothy Shelley frequently wrote of his sons urging him to distinguish himself at university and to enter poetry competition. Shelley published the posthumous fragments of Margaret Nicholson, edited by John Fitz Victor, the illegitimate son of the Victor of Victor and Césaire. Since imaging the death of the king was forbidden by the 1797 Treason Act, this was a dangerous title. Margaret Nicholson was a mentally ill woman who had attempted to assassinate George III. The book included a supposition, epithelium, between two more assassins, Charlotte Corday, who had stabbed the French revolutionary leader Marat, and Francois Ravaillac, who had assassinated Henry IV of France. The equilathium contained what some believe to be a reference of oral sex. Shelley predicted that the book would sell wildfire, and Hogg said it would be very popular. Its political anti-war views was pinned with blame for war on monarchs, could be attributed to a fictional Nicholson rather than the author. Shelley thought that no one knew who the author was, but he was wrong. At least Charles Kirkpatrick Sharp, a graduate of Christ Church, knew or guessed. This is the end of the chapter of Bysshe Shelley in Oxford and his beginning love story. If there's any truth to what's going on in this story and relates to here and today, please like and subscribe and have a nice day.